Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 512. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. Okay, so 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Guy McPherson here, and I am very excited to have as my guest today, Jenn Turner. Jenn, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, you are welcome. So Jenn graduated from Lesley University with a master's in clinical mental health counseling, and she began her career in mental health working with folks who were navigating early substance abuse recovery and experiences of complex trauma. Jenn studied yoga at Kripalu Center for Wellness and Health. She works to support clients in bringing their whole self and body into treatment in her private practice. Jenn joined the Trauma Center in 2007, where she led trauma-sensitive yoga sessions for female identifying survivors. She developed the protocol for the first randomized control trial in which trauma-sensitive yoga was observed as an adjunctive treatment for complex trauma. Along with colleague David Emerson, they began a training program for trauma-sensitive yoga practices in 2008. Not too shabby. All right, welcome once again. Before we get going, Jenn, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you're calling from now, and then we'll dive in.
Absolutely. So I'm originally from Maine. Actually, I grew up on a small island on the coast of Maine. Cool. And now I am living in the Boston area, just south of Boston. Made the COVID move out of the city. So. Oh,
you did?
Yeah, we did.
Wow.
Yeah. Got a little more space, got a little more land, bit more air to breathe.
Okay, very cool. The COVID move. Wow. That's so intense. Oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
We moved from Oakland, California to Bend, Oregon. It didn't have anything to do with COVID. Fortunately, we're in a better spot, but, and it was right around the time that, a little after when everything started, but yeah, this whole thing is crazy, but anyway. All right. So let's start here. What got you interested in counseling and therapy and in trauma?
I mean, it's always this interesting task to try to like sum that up, right? To look back and sort of say like, oh, this is how it happened. It's like, I don't really know. I was just sort of on this path, but in honesty, I mean, I discovered with my own sort of body, a disconnection from my body as a result of, I actually have a background in singing. So I studied classical voice and I had a classical voice teacher who was like, you are not in your body. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I am here. We are both here.
Right.
You know, she's like, no, go do some yoga. You're going to figure it out. So I did some yoga. I fell in love with it. And you know, without having named it as such, it helped me to heal from my own trauma. Wow. And really begin to kind of find agency within my own body. And then, you know, kind of went on to study counseling after working in the yoga studio circuit and feeling really dissatisfied with sort of just delivering a practice and feeling isolated and wanting deeper connection with my students. And, you know, had an amazing experience going back to school and diving into, you know, a holistic program that focused on trauma as well. And that's where I connected. I tried to write a paper on yoga and trauma, and Dave Emerson was doing some research at the Trauma Center at that point. Like, I need to go hang out with those people, and started to study and learn and train with them.
When that teacher said, you know, you're not in your body, and then you started doing yoga and you said that really helped you. What about it helped you specifically? Because I know that some people are listening to this and they're going, well, I've heard that. I don't know what the heck that means anyway. What does it mean? What did that mean for you?
Right. I mean, as I layer on what I know today, I can probably talk about it that way. In the moment, it was probably hard to find language, but I started to feel like my body that had felt sort of fragmented, almost like I had like, oh, I had my breath, and then I had my voice, and then there were my legs and my arm. It's like it all started to feel like one whole thing that was working in concert,
Mm.
you know, or working as one, as opposed to sort of parts of self, right, or parts of my body. And so I started to feel connected. One thing that people talk about in singing is like breathe into your, pelvic floor, or breathe into your back. I'm just like, I don't have lungs there. Like, what are you talking about? Breathe down into the floor. It's like, I don't know what you're saying. But I did, once I started doing yoga. It's like, oh right, my whole body feels like it's breathing. My whole body feels like I'm singing. Um, and so when I think about what I know today, because of the research that we've done, I think a lot about interoception, right? This capacity that we have to feel what is within our own skin, and
Mhm.
how, trauma pulls us out of that. Trauma often makes us incredibly skilled at exteroception, at reading environments, at reading the room, at reading someone's expressions in their face, and how often, if there's chaos, unpredictability, there's not an environment for us to cultivate an internal relationship with our felt sense, with our, muscles, with our stomach grumble, with our heart rate. And so we really, when people begin to connect that up, then there's often this more embodied sense.
So you started getting really interested. You said you wanted to write a paper. How did things unfold and evolve from there for you?
Yeah, I took a training at that point with some colleagues at the trauma center, and then they invited me to come teach a class there. And it was like a fit. It felt like such a great fit to hold a space for people in that way. Um, and just was sort of intuitive. And so I joined the research study at that point. They were doing, it was the first randomized control trial looking at yoga as an adjunctive treatment for PTSD. And it just sort of dove in.
Hmm.
Was completing my graduate training at that point. And so even though I was in school, and then, went on to kind of work in substance abuse for a little while, I was having this parallel experience of, leading these embodied sessions and learning about trauma through the trauma center and the folks that were working there at the time. And it just really impacted my development as a clinician, that I was sort of always thinking about, well, what about the body, and what about
Hmm.
trauma, and what's the etiology of what we're seeing in the room and in the space, as opposed to thinking of it as a mental illness. It's like, what
Hmm.
conditions caused this, and how do we
Hmm.
also talk about that?
That's really interesting. It sounds like, well, it sounds like you got really involved with becoming aware of the importance of trauma and the body very early on in your education. It sounds like
Yeah,
very
yeah.
cool. Not always the case with a lot of people. So okay, so you get involved with this research. What did the research bear out? What did it show?
Well, what it had, showed at that point, and continues to show, we just completed a 5-year NIH study through the VA using this particular model of trauma sensitive yoga. And what we see is that there are significant reductions in PTSD symptoms, and particularly in, treatment resistant PTSD. And so that's another way to sort of code complex trauma, if we're going to talk about it in a diagnostic lens. Um, that, you know, having symptoms like dissociation, like depression, like PTSD, other PTSD symptoms that were significantly reduced as a result of 10 weeks of yoga. And then those reductions were maintained
Mhm.
2 months out in a way that the control was not. And so, there were folks that were in the study that had carried the diagnosis of PTSD for many, many years, that no longer qualified for it at the end when we did
Wow.
the assessments. Um, and so, quite significant in that way. And we've seen that those results replicated too, which has been a big project of ours too, is continuing research
Right,
that's
right.
ongoing.
One of the things that, I think about when I think of yoga uh, as a treatment or therapy for trauma is, I mean, obviously yoga is such an interesting thing because it can be seem intimate, right? You're moving your body in a certain way. You're bending and folding. And can you talk a little bit about how that matches up with especially people who've experienced complex trauma who sometimes don't want to even talk about their body, right? Let alone go into their body.
Exactly. I think there's so many different layers. One piece is that it's so challenging, and when we train folks, when we speak about it, we sort of remind other practitioners and clinicians how challenging this work is, because it takes sometimes years for folks to feel ready to feel their body and turn inward.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to kind of titrate it. You can't, we talk about how making choices and moving in space is one thing. Asking people to begin to locate specific sensations and feel their breath is a whole nother layer of depth
Mm-hmm.
of, like you said, this kind of like intimacy with yourself. And then doing that with another person is also so significant, right? It's not only that I'm feeling my own body and building a relationship with myself, I'm doing it within the context of a relationship with another person who is often a power figure, right? My clinician, my yoga teacher, whatever. And so there's all of these ways in which, if we're not careful, we can replicate the trauma paradigm through subtle non-coercion, or through subtle coercion, through, even if the coercion is what I like to call benevolent coercion, where a therapist or a yoga teacher might lovingly push you to do something.
Mm-hmm.
There are ways that it's very tender and delicate, the work, in terms of making sure there's enough space between me and you for you to go inward and me to go inward, and us to do that in a shared way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could
And so,
imagine,
yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
go ahead. No.
I was just going to say, I can imagine that, you know, that act of going inward, being able to go inward, being ready to go inward and kind of meet your own body is that element which is so needed in the healing journey, right? Because which is where trauma resides, right?
Exactly. And we talk, we typically will screen for classes or sessions, and the screen is really brief. We try to make it not be overly invasive, but we will, check in and talk with people about where they're at in their healing process, because sometimes they may get the message from a clinician or someone else that, or another yoga teacher, that yoga will help them relax or feel at ease. The reality is that as we turn inward, we can often
Mm-hmm.
bump into all kinds of memories and pain and suffering. And it's not that this is exposure in any way, what we're doing, right? We're not hoping to do that, but that is the reality, right? When we hold things within our bodies, we start to pay attention to our bodies, and it's like, oh my gosh, there's so much here, right? And so educating potential, consumers, clients, that this is challenging. And if you've been through a period of destabilization in some way or another, you might want to wait until things are kind of steady enough for you to add this in, because it's hard work. It's not always soothing and relaxing. Oftentimes it is. We wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't, right? If we didn't yield positive results, but the work is hard for sure.
So are you currently seeing clients as a therapist or a yogi or what?
Yeah. So I have a couple of jobs. This is always, maybe, I don't know if you're like this too, but I always feel like I have at least 2 to 4 different jobs I'm working with to keep things interesting. So a couple of years ago, my colleague and I, David Emerson, who founded this model with me, we founded the Center for Trauma and Embodiment. And so that is a program in a nonprofit that houses trauma sensitive yoga, or TCTSY, which is our model, and a weightlifting program and a theater-based program that are all body first interventions
Oh, cool.
for trauma. And so we're really looking to develop, research, and educate in these specific models, and offer direct service that are body first approaches to healing. And so I spend time running that, leading trainings. A chunk of my time there. I have a small to medium sized private practice as well. that has moved, of course, over Zoom. I lead weekly sessions also in TCTSY, so that's in the trauma sensitive yoga, and keep things interesting.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the theater program and a weightlifting program, which
Yes.
right off the top of my head, maybe it's cliche, but they speak to very specific populations, right? I'm thinking of people who want to go into theater or people who want to go into weightlifting. Talk about that. I mean, I think that sounds awesome.
So interesting. It is. The weightlifting is really different from the yoga in some ways. One, potentially who might feel like it's for them. Some people feel like, oh, yoga isn't for me. I don't have the right body. And we could do a whole podcast about that, right? But weightlifting is also different because there's this external stuff that we get
Mm-hmm.
to, they base it around Olympic style weightlifting. And so there's this element of like the bar and your
Mm-hmm.
relationship to the bar, and then beginning to expand your window of tolerance by adding a little bit of stress by having heavier weights. And that does make your nervous system do a thing when you start to work on different kind of, moves. And they would probably make fun of me with the language I'm using,
Mm-hmm.
or tease me, but doing different kind of lifts, it's going to add stress. But the survivor is completely in charge of how much they want to add, how little, their relationship with the trainer. So it's still really relational
Mm-hmm.
and focused on sensation, but there's this external object. And then also kind of expanding the window of tolerance in a way. And then theater, it's a lot more play. It's focused a lot around kids and adolescents, but this opportunity to use play in the body and opportunities for that to process, to feel and sense through experiences that are traumatic and complicated. And
Mm-hmm.
the kids and the troupe sort of join together and do these different modules that focus on different aspects of trauma.
One of the things that strikes me about a lot of what you're doing is treating trauma, working with trauma in kind of a group setting, right? with
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people, and obviously you're doing private practice too. Um, it reminds me of one of the things that Bessel van der Kolk talks about in his book, your own facility, which sounds amazing. So you have trainings online. Do you have trainings online or?
So we're a global program, which is kind of cool as well. And so we don't have a physical location. We've always been remote, actually.
Okay.
So we travel and we move around, but we've been remote because we're global. We have about 400 facilitators that we've trained around the world. We have training hubs in Australia and Berlin and Latin America. And those are in-person trainings, but and there's direct service happening all over. And I think
Mm-hmm.
like 42 different countries and First Nation communities. But we don't have like a space, which is kind of works now in COVID and
Sure.
everything. But yeah, and that's largely the yoga program, but the weightlifting program is starting research and growing, and the rescripted theater program is just behind it as well in the pipeline.
Mm.
So it's been a busy 2 years or so.
I'm wondering if you can share with us an early clinical error and what you learned from it.
So many. Um, so which one to choose is the question. Well, here's a good one. So this was actually my second year internship. And at this point, I had been working at the trauma center for a little while, was starting to feel like could kind of wrap my arms around, the trauma and the body and why it mattered and why it was important. And so I had kind of asked permission to bring in some movement and breathing into the partial hospital programs. It was a psychiatric partial kind of like day program. And so we would sit in these groups during the day around this big room, and kind of in a disembodied way, right? Like doing cognitive behavioral work. Maybe people are sharing, but we're sitting and we're not moving. So then I lead a group. I start leading a group and talk a little bit about breath and the body, and start cueing people to breathe, to notice their breathing. It's invitational. I'm doing all the trauma sensitive stuff. But what starts to happen is that, like, bit by bit in the room, it's like one client says, Jen, I'm really triggered. I need to see my case manager. I can't do this. They leave. Another person does that. And then another person. And I'm like, okay, I'm doing something wrong here. Like, why don't we stop? And why don't we do something different? So we get up and we start moving around and shift the energy in the room. As I was reflecting on that, and even when I think about that today, what I was doing without meaning to is, if you think about when you take a deep breath, if you don't have like a relationship with your body, you haven't done any like breathing training or meditation, you take a deep breath, you just take an inhalation and your heart rate kind of increases. Right. You exhale, your heart rate decreases, right? And so what I was doing is I was having people who were totally disembodied, were sitting all day, they're sort of fresh out of the hospital, potentially with their own trauma of that, with their own, feeling what their body feels like on new medications, and inviting them to breathe. And all I was doing was jacking up their heart rate, right? Taking a big breath in. And what was also happening, which is what I have since learned, is when we start to feel these interoceptive or internal sensations like our own breath or our own heartbeat, if we haven't ever felt them before, it can be really scary and terrifying to feel and sense our own body, something we might take for granted if we're used to feeling it. And so for me, that started to cue me into the importance of the relationship to breath and how breath has the capacity to really change how we feel in a heartbeat, for better or for worse, and how we can't skip embodiment. We can't skip feeling our body and being connected to our body if we're going to do this sort of these breathing practices. Might be sort of a nuanced one, but it is one that I use as a trainer a lot to talk about both the asset and liability of breath work.
Right. Wow. In terms of, a lot of people are listening to this who are kind of starting out on their trauma-informed journey. There are therapists who, have experience, but are just beginning to kind of learn about trauma. Where would you suggest people start? I mean, there's so many modalities out there. How the heck does someone go about choosing, in your opinion?
Right. I mean, I have my bias, right? I mean, I do think, how do people go about choosing? I don't know if I know the answer to that.
Well, let me ask you a different question. Yeah. Do you, I mean, would you recommend someone, you got to learn about the body. It's imperative, right? Is that a good place for someone to start?
Absolutely. I think that if you're approaching trauma work from a cognitive, thought-based perspective, you're only getting a fraction of the healing potential. And so when we start to explore it from a body first or body forward perspective, then we can access all of these other parts of the brain that I think in general in the clinical world, we're not always so great at getting to, or we rely heavily on our cognition to get there. And so absolutely starting with some kind of body-based modality where there is attention paid to the relationship and to power dynamics and to sharing power. And because sometimes those can also just be reenactments of expert versus non, or like sick versus well, that we want to shift some of those dynamics.
Awesome. All right. Let me just remind everyone that I'm speaking with Jenn Turner. Jenn, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
So the best way would be to check out our website, traumasensitiveyoga.com, or I have a website, jen-turner.com. Those are great ways to reach out. I don't know if we were going to talk about the book at all. Did we want to talk about the book?
Yes, I do. I was going to get there.
Oh, good. Okay. I was like, I'm ready to talk about it.
Let's do that now.
Awesome. Yeah. So those are great ways to get in touch, and people can find the book there too.
Okay. So let's talk about the book. Tell us about it.
So the book is called Embodied Healing, and it is a collection of essays from the practice of trauma-sensitive yoga. What I have found, which I edited, but it's a collection of all colleagues and myself sharing different and co-writing sometimes with clients. What I have found in the field of sort of trauma research, trauma in the body, there's a lot of focus on it's expert driven, right? On the voices of experts, neuroscience, clinicians, but we miss out on this, the voices of survivor and the wisdom and information that we can really get from the survivor's felt experience of using the body as a modality. And so this book is supposed, the intention is that it's sort of survivor first or forward. It's a way to, honor the wisdom that people bring and the knowledge that folks have of their own kind of healing journey, but also to illustrate what it looks like to do this work. It's almost like you get you kind of peek into the nuance and subtlety of working with the body along the healing journey from complex trauma.
What drove you to write the book in the first place?
It has been, I've wanted to do this project for a long time because I feel like the best learning and training that I have gotten is from feedback, is from input from clients, is really getting curious and interested in someone's felt and lived experience. I think, sometimes there's a danger as we go further into our careers and into a field as we become experts, that we can lose that curiosity. And so sometimes we miss opportunities to really hear and know how someone's felt or lived experience is different than what we learned in our training or from the books that we read. And so really highlighting the voices of folks that have experienced it firsthand, but also there's a lot of attention paid in the book to the relationship, to the subtle dance, particularly around navigating having two bodies or 6 bodies in a room that are kind of carrying their own histories and how we move together and create community. So I'm so excited that the book it finally is, because it's been kind of on my mind for years to bring something like this forward.
Yeah, I really love that. And, it's something that I've noticed in this whole interview from the moment we started talking, your awareness and the attention that you pay to not just the knowledge about how trauma impacts the brain and the body, but relationally, the importance of that and the power dynamics. So very interesting and crucial too. I really appreciate that.
It's been such a big part of kind of creating a safer space for people to turn inward. I think about it like we want to turn the dial down on the relational noise so that there's not as much relational noise. I'm not tending to you wondering what you want from me or what you want me to do. So that's quiet enough that I can then go inward, but that takes a lot of work to get to that space, particularly when the relationship is the scene of the crime. It's not, the battlefield. It's not out on the highway. It is the relationship where the bad stuff has happened. And so we have to tend to it.
How much of that piece did you already have when you started this work?
I think it was intuitive for sure to some degree, but it also was something that we continued to learn time and time again as we would make mistakes. And then the most important thing wasn't getting it right every time, saying the right thing, choosing the right shapes, cueing the right breath, but was about then what happens next? How do we listen to the feedback? How do we internalize it and say, you know what, great, that's super helpful. I'm sorry that I said that thing and it triggered you. What about this? How could we try it this way? And being open to not being the expert, being open to not knowing all the answers. And I think our training isn't always oriented in that way, to be so curious about how what we're saying is landing for our clients.
Wow. Awesome. Gold for newer therapists. Really, truly, it is. All right. So once again, the book is Embodied Healing, Survivor and Facilitator Voices from the Practices of Trauma-Sensitive Yoga. I'll have that listed up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. if it's okay with you, I'll also like to include that in my newsletter coming out in February.
Great.
So we'll get it out there too. Sounds awesome, man. I love talking to you, Jen. You are awesome.
It was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like we could just keep on riffing.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. And we'll have everything again listed up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. I appreciate you being open and really sharing your story.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care.
Okay. You too.